Let me do what this show has sought to do for 9 years, which is try to close the gap between what people say privately and what is said on live TV. This is from a super donor. This is a pathetic display. We're no better than they are, mouthing talking points that no one believes. A Democratic member of Congress texted me this morning and said it's almost over, just waiting for someone to pull the plug. This is about Joe Biden's candidacy. This is what my colleagues, Jonathan Allen and Carol Lee, reported today. Quote, several of President Joe Biden's closest allies, including 3 people who are directly involved in efforts to reelect him, told NBC News they now see his chances of winning at 0. And the likelihood of him taking down fellow Democratic candidates growing. Quote, he needs to drop out. One Biden campaign official said he will never recover from this. My phone is full of Biden allies sending me poll numbers, sending me statements from Democratic members of Congress who have defected and who said they have gone home and received no criticism but praise from their constituents for doing it. This is not a president or a campaign season about whether tax cuts go up or down. It is not a campaign season that is about whose health plan. This is about whether there is a health plan. This is about whether there is a democracy. This is about whether in January we're covering mass arrests of the Clinton, the Obamas, and the Bidens. And I want to know from you, Mark Elias, when the public conversation will match the private one.
So look, I think you're seeing day by day, including today, there are different statements from different members that are coming out on all different sides of this. And that is part of this process that we are unfortunately been stuck in the last 2 weeks, as you point out. I do want to add one thing to a point you made, though, when you asked David his last question about, who benefits from the cynicism that none of this matters. And the only person who benefits from the cynicism that none of this matters is Donald Trump. The only person who will benefit from people staying home is Donald Trump. And so it is important that when this political process sorts itself out, as it will need to, because the convention is coming upon us, that all Democrats and all right-thinking people reject the cynicism that is being offered to them by Chryssala Savita and Susie Wiles, that they reject the cynicism that Donald Trump wants to seep into the discussion, and that we understand the importance of the threats to democracy.
I mean, David Jolly, I guess I come back to you with the question of what now distinguishes the two parties when you've got Republicans who've long said something very different about Donald Trump in private than they do in public, right? Sure. You now have the same thing happening in the Democratic Party.
Among elected officials. And I think this is very important because just as we would suggest that top Democrats might be gaslighting. And I use that term about the White House staff in the first 72 hours after the debate. I remain unsettled by what I saw, but I accept the reality that Joe Biden has said, trust me, I can do this, and he made the decision to stay in. And so now it's a contrast. And so this is where I would suggest the parties are different. If that donor that was quoted or that anonymous elected official or that Democratic leader who is quoted saying, we have to do something, we have to pull the plug on Biden, you're undermining democracy because you're invalidating 14 million votes of Democrats across the country that handed Joe Biden the nomination. There were 16 million Democrats that participated in the Democratic primary to choose their nominee. Over 14 million chose Joe Biden. 2 million chose somebody else. And the notion that members of Congress or a machine or a donor is going to come in and say, hey, voters, no, 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 no. You don't really control the party. We do. It's the most Republican thing of all that Democrats could do in this moment. And that's where they would ultimately fail the test about democracy. This isn't easy. It's not good. The Democratic voters nominated Joe Biden. Joe Biden said he's staying in. So now your choice is between Biden and Trump. That's it.
Well, I don't think anyone is saying that the party leaders have any power at all, because they wouldn't be texting reporters if they did, right? But I don't think anybody does. I think if we're going to stay true to what we've tried to do in these 2 hours, the only person with any power to do anything different is Joe Biden. And Joe Biden wants all the same things that we do. Joe Biden wants to continue to live in a democracy. Joe Biden's own son would be probably the first person to the Bidens have more on the line than anybody. And in terms of legacy and library, I mean, the legacy for Joe Biden right now is not just do you win or lose an election. For Joe Biden, it's, do you end the American experiment? So I appreciate your point, but I'm not saying that the Democratic Party leaders have any power at all. I think we watched the Republicans, and it's clear that there's no such thing as, we live in sort of a post-party leader America. The only person with any power, because of years of legal and political movements, is the president. So what we're actually talking about, Mark Elias, is what does Joe Biden do?
I think Joe Biden is going to give a press conference later today, and he and all of us will have more information after that. And then I think, he has said he has made his decision. But, I've been in politics long enough to know decisions are not made until they have to be made. And so, we will see what he does.
David Jolly, I hate when I feel like we're misaligned in what we're saying. I'm not saying anything different than you are.
Actually.
It's obvious. There's nobody with any. No one can make Joe Biden do anything. I guess my question to you is, what does Joe Biden do?
Yeah, so, Nicole, we're not actually misaligned. I think you and I see this correctly, which is the only person that can make a decision is Joe Biden. And Joe Biden made that decision, but leading Democrats don't like it. Well, sorry. I mean, look, voters made their decision. Joe Biden made his decision. If you're a leading Democrat who doesn't like it, your job is not to tank your nominee, because that will give us Donald Trump. Your job is to unify. Now, privately, if you want to continue your conversations with your nominee, and if circumstances change, and if Joe Biden himself decides, maybe now's not the time, maybe I should step back, then unify around that decision. Joe Biden gave you his decision. And if you're a donor who doesn't want to give another dollar, fine, risk giving us Donald Trump. If you're a leading Democrat who refuses to listen to your nominee, recognize you're just refusing to listen to him, because you don't have any power in this say. So you can have as many meetings over on the Hill as you want, but you're sitting around a campfire, patting each other on the back, and it's not making a bit of difference. Joe Biden made his decision. If you don't like it, it's too bad. If he changes his mind, maybe you'll like it. But he's not changing his mind right now. He's your nominee. You're with him or you're with Donald Trump. And I get it. It's a hard situation for all of us. But Biden will protect freedom on the world stage, protect American democracy. Donald Trump will end it. It's that simple.
Trump has openly vowed, if reelected, he'll be a dictator on day one. So let us be clear. This represents an outright attack on our children, our families, and our future. If Trump gets the chance, he will sign a national abortion ban. But we are not going to let that happen. We know, women know what's in their own best interest and don't need their government telling them what to do with their body. As Trump bows down to dictators, he makes America weak. And that is disqualifying for someone who wants to be commander-in-chief of the United States of America.
As President Joe Biden convenes world leaders this week for the NATO summit, Vice President Kamala Harris has been on the campaign trail, continuing to vigorously prosecute the case against Donald Trump, highlighting the stakes of this election in terms of whether or not we remain a democracy. Vice President Harris's campaign tour comes amid growing angst and chatter, even within the Biden campaign and allies themselves, about whether or not the vice president might be better equipped to prevail in November after President Joe Biden's performance in the first debate. New York Times out this afternoon with this reporting, quote, President Biden's campaign is quietly testing the strength of Vice President Kamala Harris against former President Trump in a head-to-head survey of voters. The survey, which is being conducted this week and was commissioned by the Biden campaign's analytics team, is believed to be the first time since the debate that Mr. Biden's aides have sought to measure how the vice president would fare at the top of the ticket. The results of that survey could determine whether Joe Biden remains at the top of the ticket. New York Times also reporting that a key group of advisors to the president believe that the strength of the vice president might sway his decision to stay in this race. Quote, a small group of Mr. Biden's advisors in the administration and the campaign have said they would have to convince the president of several things. They said they would have to make the case to the president, who remains convinced of the strength of his campaign, that he cannot win against former President Donald Trump. They have to persuade him to believe that another candidate, like Vice President Kamala Harris, could beat Mr. Trump. And they have to assure Mr. Biden that should he step aside, the process to choose another candidate would be orderly and not devolve into chaos in the Democratic Party. In a statement to the New York Times, the White House denied that there was an effort by members of President Biden's team to convince President Biden to exit the race. Joining our coverage, New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt, whose byline is on that New York Times reporting about what the president's advisors are discussing behind the scenes, and the president of the Reproductive Freedom for All, folks that we turn to all the time on all matters, is here for this. Mini Timuraju. Mike Schmidt, take me through what you and your colleagues are reporting in the story about the advisors, as well as the story about the president's own political operatives testing Vice President Harris head-to-head with Trump.
Well, what we're reporting is that there's a realization amongst some of these longtime Biden aides that he's going to have to exit the race, and that the biggest obstacle to that will be having to convince him to do that. And the story really encapsulates what the story of the moment is, which is essentially a standoff between Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party that is around the edges saying some things, but at the top of the party is not coming out and publicly forcefully asking him to get off the ticket, and the president sort of digging his heels in even further. We report in the story that the president had said before the debate that he thought he had a far better chance of beating Trump than the vice president. This is a conviction that he has maintained in the aftermath of the debate. And, different from him, there's a realization amongst some aides that his candidacy is not going to work, that it is too far of an uphill battle, that he needs to step aside, and that they have to figure out a way to get him there and to convince him to do that.
Mike Schmidt, the advisors that are quoted in both these stories seem to be engaged in a little bit of what Nancy Pelosi was doing yesterday. She showed up on Morning Joe, seemingly speaking to one person known to be in the audience pretty regularly. Is there, the reporting sort of inches at the idea that he's somewhat isolated with just a very, very small group of advisors. Is that how these other advisors see the situation right now?
Well, we don't have full visibility into everything that the president is doing and who he's meeting with, but there is a notion among some of these advisors that, the president had spent a lot of time with his family in the aftermath of the debate, that, there is not a ton of access to a lot of people have to the president, and that's been the case for some time, as the president has been a bit cloistered off. And the question that many Democrats have is the president, getting full advice and full counsel from everyone, and does he have a true appreciation of the polls? Out of all the Democratic politicians and aides that I've talked to, I can find very few that will say, on background or off the record, that they think that the president should stay in the race. And I think the question in the coming days will be is, how does the Democratic Party ratchet up that pressure? What does it do? And what does the press conference today mean? Is a press conference able to put the toothpaste back in the tube from the debate? I don't think that the Stephanopoulos interview got them to the point that they thought it was going to get them to. There's still questions here with someone like Nancy Pelosi coming out and saying the president has to make a decision when the president apparently had already made a decision. So it really is a standoff. And it will be now, heading into the third week. It was only 2 weeks ago that the debate happened.
Minnie, the most intriguing piece of all of this is that the president's data team is polling Harris versus Trump. I have been watching her for years. I have paid extra close attention, as has the country, I think, these last 2 weeks. And she's always been, I think, his most effective surrogate. She's become electric, not just on the stump, but on the rope line. The attacks against Trump are among the sharpest being offered in the Democratic Party right now. And I wonder what you think it means that they're poll testing, at least, just maybe keeping every option on the table, or maybe trying to bolster the president's view that only he can beat Trump. I don't know. But it is intriguing that they want to understand where voters stand if the question is Kamala Harris or Donald Trump.
I agree that it's intriguing, and I've always thought the vice president was electric on the trail. I want to go back to a couple of things, however, that Mike said, because I am a Democrat who you can talk to, who is 100% behind Joe Biden. Reproductive freedom voters, and Nicole, you and I have talked about this, the base of the party, women, people of color, most of the elected officials who have come forward, like the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I have 40 million members of my organization. We are in battleground states. We are in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada. We are with the president and the vice president. And it is because of his commitment and this administration's demonstration of their work, their incredible success on a progressive agenda that includes reproductive freedom, the fact that they've gone to bat, they've gone to war on our behalf. And yes, Vice President Harris has been tip of the spear. She's been incredibly dynamic in this space, particularly post-Dobbs, really out there like a warrior fighting for so many of us. But we also have to remember, Joe Biden asked Kamala Harris to take on the Reproductive Rights Task Force. He asked her to go out and be the fiercest defender she could for these issues. And it's his administration, his DOJ, his HHS that has been at the Supreme Court on the front lines of this fight at a time where abortion has never been a more popular issue. And when abortion is on the ballot, abortion wins. And right now, reproductive freedom advocates, we're behind Joe Biden.
It is the 900-page book that Team Trump doesn't ever want you to read or crack open or really even know about. It is the single most comprehensive effort to put MAGA's authoritarian vision and plans on paper. It's the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, and it is now bursting into public view in spite of, or maybe because of, Trump's repeated denials. Even in spaces where Project 2025 is not explicitly mentioned or quoted, the vision it outlines is on the lips of every MAGA acolyte and true believer. Semaphore is reporting this from a conservative conference this week. Quote, Trump comes back in January. I'll be on his heels coming back, and I will run the biggest deportation force this country has ever seen. That was former ICE Director Tom Homan at a panel on immigration policy. Quote, they ain't seen bleep yet. Wait till 2025. Wait till 2025. Trump's allies are not even trying to hide the radical plans for the country should Donald Trump prevail in November and serve another term. As for Donald Trump himself, he's once again claiming he's never heard of Project 2025. He knows nothing about it, saying in a post on his website, Truth Social, this morning this, quote, I have not seen it. I have no idea who is in charge of it, end quote. But the ties between Team Trump and the Heritage Foundation run deep and wide. Just ask them. Here's Trump back in 2022.
Because our country is going to hell. The critical job of institutions such as Heritage is to lay the groundwork, and Heritage does such an incredible job at that. This is a great group, and they're going to lay the groundwork and detailed plans for exactly what our movement will do and what your movement will do when the American people give us a colossal mandate to save America. And that's coming. That's coming.
And it turns out that the Heritage Foundation agrees wholeheartedly with what Trump just said about them. Here's the director of Project 2025 on a podcast in a clip unearthed by Media Matters.
I think, President Trump's very bought in with this. We're fortunate to have John McEntee, who many of your listeners may know helmed the Office of Presidential Personnel in what I would call the fourth quarter of the first term of Trump. But he is one of our senior advisors.
The Heritage Foundation will even play a large and public role at Trump's coronation as the head of the Republican Party next week at the convention in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reports this, quote, the Heritage Foundation, that D.C.-based think tank that produced Project 2025, is among the sponsors of the convention in Milwaukee. The group is touted as a convention partner on the RNC Host Committee's website, and Heritage plans to hold a day-long policy fest in downtown Milwaukee Monday, the opening day of a convention in which Trump will officially receive the Republican nomination for president. Project 2025 and its autocratic vision for the country simply underscoring once again the stakes of the November election. It's where we start again today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The president of Media Matters for America, Angelo Carusone, is back with us. Plus, NBC News correspondent, my friend and colleague Vaughn Hilliard is back, and former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann is back. Vaughn Hilliard, I know you've been pouring through this on our behalf. What do you make? I mean, they are one and the same. McEntee is essential. He figured prominently in some of the taped depositions from the January 6th Select Committee. He was the guy that Ginny Thomas handed the loyalty list to. I mean, he's been in charge of the loyalty oath and the kinds of people and the staff being pure enough and Trumpy enough since the first Trump term. He's a Project 2025 guy who's so proud of his association. He talks about it on TV. Talk about this bizarre effort to distance Trump from Project 2025.
Right. John McEntee was the former director of the personnel office in the White House. He was his former personal aide, and he is the one who is overseeing the database of Project 2025 in a senior advisor capacity, because Project 2025 has talked about the idea of having the executive have the ability to fire tens of thousands of civil servants across departments and agencies, making the case that it is the agencies and departments and the employees that should be properly executing what the desires of the president of the executive office are. And so what they essentially have done over the last 2 years is sought to build a recruitment tool and ask questions of prospective employees who would be political appointees that would be able to then come in and fill these roles that were previously served by the civil servants. And, you know, John McEntee is not the only individual. You also have the likes of Russ Vought, who was the former OMB director in the Trump administration, and he is one of the leading authors of Project 2025, that 900-page policy roadmap. But also, again, this is where Donald Trump, and almost in a way I feel bad for the folks at Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation for Donald Trump trying to disassociate himself, because these are folks who were doing this work on behalf of him, and somebody, as that clip shows, wholly understood that they were doing this work on behalf of him. Russ Vought not only was a leading author of Project 2025, but also is the policy director of the RNC's platform committee, which just this week released their own platform. And so essentially he had his hand in writing both. And again, this is where that intersection between the two is so strong. And frankly, it is very difficult for Donald Trump, who used Heritage Foundation in 2016 to help build out his personnel and policies for his first administration, to have a blanket denial of his association or familiarity with them.
Andrew Weissmann, when I asked Angelo last week, we were talking about this, and I think we were talking about deportation, or we were talking about DOJ, and he said, this isn't even the scariest thing in it. And when I came back and asked him what is, he said it's granularity. We asked you, with that in mind, to read the FBI DOJ section for its granularity and report back. Tell us what you found and what you thought.
Sure. And I think I'm going to give you one illustration that I think explains why you are seeing this effort to backpedal, to say I'm disassociating from it. There's so much in here. Obviously, it's 900 pages. There's a huge section on the Department of Justice. But let me give something that is in black and white for viewers on page 562. 562, you can see it in black and white. You don't have to take anyone's word for it. It is criminalizing, that is enforcing by criminal law, the shipping of anything that could in any way promote getting an abortion. Any material. The criminal law is any article, instrument, substance, drug, medicine, or thing which is advertised or described in a manner calculated to lead another person to produce an abortion. That is explicitly called on to seek enforcement of the criminal law with respect to eradicating the ability to in any way facilitate an abortion. I should say the same criminal laws also apply to anything that would interfere with conception. So one of the things when Donald Trump says, I'm distancing myself, one question that should be put to him is, what about this provision? This is in black and white. Do you agree with this, or are you going to say, no, that was done without authorization? I have no idea, and I completely reject that as a possibility. This is just one example. There are a lot more esoteric examples, things that I care about as in terms of the independence of the Department of Justice. But if you want something that goes to real people's lives in this country, on page 562, you can read it in black and white.
Well, the luxury of having 2 hours is we don't really need to get beyond this section because we have the next hour and we have tomorrow. So let me stay right here. Von Hilliard, has anyone had access to Trump since people have become more fluent with these kinds of details inside Project 2025 to ask him yet this question that Andrew points out about? I think it's, let me read it. Let me put it up here. It's about enforcing the Comstock Act, right, Andrew? And it says federal law prohibits mailing every article, instrument, substance, drug, medicine, or thing which is advertised or described in a manner calculated to lead another to use or apply it for producing abortion. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, there is now no federal prohibition on the enforcement of the statute. The Department of Justice in the next conservative administration should therefore announce its intent to enforce federal law against providers and distributors of such pills. Has anyone had a chance to ask him about that yet?
No, and it's Donald Trump is not keen on doing interviews, and so of course we have not had the opportunity to ask him those questions really since he started to distance himself from this project. And the background of this project here is, Heritage Foundation will tell you that they put together a similar book, a policy roadmap for Ronald Reagan back in 1980 when he won the White House. And so, I think for the American public, there is some benefit of seeing 900 pages worth of policy written down on paper. And for Donald Trump, he has been clear through his campaign that he alone speaks for himself. Yet at the same time, there are folks like Stephen Miller, who continues to work in the capacity of an advisor to Project 2025 and an advisor to Donald Trump. Caroline Leavitt, who is his current press secretary, is featured in Project 2025 promotional material online. Ben Carson, the former secretary, is one of the authors as well of Project 2025 chapters. And so for Donald Trump, I think this is where this is all going to be coming to a head, where some of these conservative organizations, I want to be clear, it's not just Heritage Foundation, more than 100 other groups have backed and allied this project, including the likes of Turning Point USA, led by Charlie Kirk. And each of these different organizations understands that a potential majority in Congress and having Donald Trump back in the White House is an opportunity to enact policy that they have long sought. And so for these organizations, there is a reckoning that Donald Trump can be used as a powerful tool to go and see this through. Yet at the same time, Donald Trump and his campaign team understand they need to win an election 4 months from now, and not every one of the policies stipulated in these 900 pages is exactly popular among the vast majority of Americans.
I don't fault you if it's not on your calendar, but the Republican National Convention starts in 4 days, and Donald Trump has yet to announce his running mate. He sent the last guy to be hung at the insurrection. But what has been a years-long campaign featuring some of the most power-craven Trump sycophants, especially in a post-January 6th era, has now whittled down to 3 top contenders who have kissed the ring often enough and enthusiastically enough to be on the list, the short list for Trump's VP pick. They include Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, and Florida Senator Marco Rubio, once famously nicknamed Little Marco. But before the former Apprentice host makes his next hire, here's what some of those candidates have said about Donald Trump, the disgraced convicted ex-president they now desperate want to serve as his number 2.
We are not going to turn over the conservative movement to a con artist who was telling people one thing but has spent 40 years sticking it to working Americans and now claims to be their champion.
Would you ever do business with Donald Trump?
I don't think so.
Why?
I just think that it's important that you're judged by the company you keep, and You
just wouldn't do business with him?
No, I wouldn't.
Well, Senator, this is an evolution, and I know you've been asked about this before, about past comments that you've made about Donald Trump. You've said, I'm a never Trump guy, never liked him, terrible candidate, idiot if you voted for him, might be America's Hitler, might be a cynical a-hole, cultural heroine, noxious and reprehensible.
I was wrong about Donald Trump. I didn't think he was going to be a good president, Brett. He was a great president.
And you know what they say about men with small hands? You can't trust them. You can't trust them.
We're back with NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. So is it the guy who called him America's Hitler, the guy who got in a fight with him on stage about the size of his hands, or the guy who said you're judged by the character of the company you keep?
Right. I think, frankly, the anticipation was that he was going to have a VP candidate, a running mate, somebody who would be ultimately loyal to him. The reason that he threw Mike Pence off the cliff was because ultimately he was loyal for only 4.5 years, not loyal in Donald Trump's mind on January 6th. And when you look at these three finalists, look, who was on the campaign trail with Marco Rubio when he was making some of these comments in that 2016 campaign when he was challenging him, he directly made reference that Donald Trump had, quote, third world strongman rhetoric. The idea that put your faith in me and I'll make things better. He's going to single-handedly do this or that. He went on to say if he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan. It's really a stark contrast, but even more so, the North Dakota governor, Doug Burgum, those comments to our Chuck Todd came just 1 year ago. And it's notable, just in a radio conversation with a right-wing outlet yesterday, Donald Trump, when he was mentioning Doug Burgum, he said that he wasn't so sure about him because he signed a 6-week abortion ban in the state of North Dakota, which may have gone too far, which again brings into the idea that Donald Trump is looking politically at who could be advantageous for him here. Of course, if Marco Rubio were to be the selection, one of them would have to change residencies. And if Marco Rubio were to do that, of course, he would have to step aside his position as U.S. Senator because he represents Florida. So there's a lot on the line here, potentially. But, of course, you're looking at potentially that decision coming in Milwaukee at the convention, Nicole.
Vaughn, is there any chance it's none of these three, or is the reporting pretty solid that it's one of these three?
Ultimately, I keep getting told that the decision will come from Donald Trump. And I think, frankly, there were some people that have whispered to me, Ben Carson, somebody who had no interest in running for president ever again, somebody who has been loyal to a T to him through not only his time in the administration, but in the 4 years since. But also look at the likes of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, somebody who was one of the impeachment managers to defend him. And over the course of the last 5 years has been a stalwart defender of his, somebody who has been on the national airwaves trying to strike that strong defense. And most of her public critiques of him were not, public. They were made in private and have been written about. But so I think there is definitely an open question mark. 2 weeks ago, he said that he had made up his mind. But just this week, he is now suggesting that he is still trying to make his decision. And I think one other note on this here, Nicole, is when you're looking at who that running mate would be, there's serious questions. Who would potentially certify election results and go along with anything come 2029? And Marco Rubio did certify the 2020 election. So I think that there is a lot that we not only are looking at potentially here for this November, but also what that individual, the role they would serve during the administration.
Why hasn't he done it yet? What's moved the timing?
I think it's a good question. He did suggest this week that he was waiting to see whether Joe Biden would potentially drop off the ticket, that could change his decision-making process. Of course, Tim Scott was a perceived front runner early on when he joined him up on stage at a campaign rally in New Hampshire and then went and was there with him for each of the months that followed. But he's really dropped in this. But potentially Tim Scott, if Kamala Harris were to move to the top of the ticket, would, of course, increase in his consideration. But of course, J.D. Vance, our colleague Henry Gomez is now reporting that Don Jr. is going to be giving the final speech ahead of the VP selection at the convention. He and J.D. Vance have struck up a close relationship over the last 2 years. They share a team of advisors, and potentially that could be indication of which direction he is going. J.D. Vance has really been an outspoken individual who we could get much more into this conversation on the idea of firing the civil workforce. He has been a big proponent of increasing the executive powers to ensure that individuals in the departments and agencies at the civil workforce level are ready to carry out the orders of the president and the executives in the administration. And so I think J.D. Vance is very much the one who has most closely come to speaking the ideas of Project 2025 and the Trump world. And so I think that if he is ultimately their pick, I think that Donald Trump sees somebody who is willing to carry out what he seeks to do inside of his administration in a second term.
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. It was the mic drop moment for all the wrong reasons. A statement heard all around the world. The then president of the United States of America siding with a murderous dictator over his own intelligence officials on the question of election interference. We entered a new era of American foreign policy during that hour on that day, where having a leader who would always choose and side with democracy was no longer a given for us. Now, of course, Donald Trump is no longer the president, and President Joe Biden has worked tirelessly to restore America's standing on the world stage, to reassure world leaders that we are the America they know and trust. But ever present is the looming concern that if Trump returns to office, he will align America with the dictators and autocrats he so frequently publicly admires, much more than any of our own allies. That fear was furthered by what's happening today. Following the NATO summit that President Joe Biden has been leading, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban is set to meet with the disgraced ex-president down at Mar-a-Lago. Orban, who's already endorsed Donald Trump for president, has reshaped Hungary's government to keep his own party and friends in power. He's cracked down on the press as well as the independence of Hungary's judiciary. Sounds eerily similar to the objectives laid out in black and white by conservatives here in America in their Project 2025 manifesto. Orban's meeting today with Trump follows a busy calendar of meeting with other autocrats. On Monday, Orban met with China's Xi Jinping, and last week Orban met with Russian President Vladimir Putin, putting this meeting with Trump in even starker relief. As David Rothkopf puts it, quote, "This is Trump putting it out there again in boldface and red letters in case you missed it the last several hundred times he did it, that he is not only Putin's poodle, but that he now leads a political party that is pro-Putin, pro-Russian, pro-aggression, pro-war crimes, pro-authoritarianism, anti-NATO, anti-Ukraine, and most importantly, anti-American national interests." We heard that message from Trump himself loud and clear when he repeated his threat to our NATO allies at his rally this week.
I said, you have to pay your bills. They said, sir, may I ask you a question? If we don't pay our bills, will you protect us from Russia? I said, you mean you're delinquent? They said, yes, we're delinquent. Let's say we're delinquent. Would you protect us? I said, no, I will not protect you from Russia.
It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and MSNBC International Affairs analyst Michael McFaul is back, plus former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and Executive Director of the McCain Institute, Evelyn Farkas, is here, and former top State Department official during the Obama administration, Rick Stengel, is here with us. You just cannot keep them apart, Evelyn Farkas, Trump and Orban, Orban and Trump. This is extraordinary, even for Trump, that he's meeting with him again.
Yeah, I mean, Nicole, it's pretty horrible. Frankly, Viktor Orban, we should find a way to discipline Hungary within the NATO context for its actions, giving Vladimir Putin a pass, not helping Ukraine with military assistance. He just came from visiting Moscow, visiting Beijing, visiting our adversaries. And now he's going to go see Donald Trump on the heels of the NATO summit, where he was relatively quiet. But one wonders, is he bringing messages from Xi and from Putin to Trump? Because, as you showed the picture from the Helsinki summit, we still don't know what President Trump and Vladimir Putin talked about for over an hour at the Helsinki summit all those many years ago. So Orban is a problem because he's got a recipe, he said, for how to take down a democracy and make it an illiberal democracy, which is just another way of saying not a democracy.
Let me show you, Ambassador McFaul, Trump in his own words on Orban and other autocrats.
There's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. He's fantastic. As you know, the Prime Minister of Hungary and does a great job. is a non-controversial figure because he said this is the way it's going to be, and that's the end of it, right? He's the boss. And you know, he's a great leader, fantastic leader in Europe and all over the world. They respect him. Think of President Xi, central casting, brilliant guy. You know, when I say he's brilliant, everyone says, oh, that's terrible. You call it. Well, he runs 1.4 billion people with an iron fist. Smart, brilliant, everything perfect. I was really being tough, and so was he. And we would go back and forth. And then we fell in love. Okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters. And they're great letters. We fell in love.
Ambassador, the last one he was talking about Kim Jong-un, murderous leader of North Korea, who he honored with a visit. It seems, and I don't know if this is possible because I'm always worried about relativity, but it seems that Trump has become more comfortable being more brazenly enthusiastic about the world's most brutal autocrats and dictators.
Tragically, I think you're right. I mean, he's had many opportunities if he wanted to distance himself from those horrific comments that you just replayed from 2018, right? It would have been so easy for him. It would be politically easy for him to do. And instead, he just keeps doubling down. He just did it at the rally. He invited Viktor Orban to come see him. He didn't invite President Zelensky. And therefore, I think it's really just a very stark choice that the American people have. Do they want to elect to be the leader of the United States, somebody who embraces dictators, or do they want to elect a president who embraces and supports Democrats? It's just crystal clear. Before remember, they tried to fake it. They would say, that's not what he really meant, Mike, when I would talk to White House officials, and he stands up for democracy, yada, yada, yada. Now it's just black and white. The American people have a choice. Support Democrats or support autocrats.
Let me show you what, to me, Rick Stengel, is almost a fetishizing of Vladimir Putin.
So you know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do. Putin's a killer. A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
It was when President Bush had said, I've looked in his eyes and saw a soul. I said, looked in your eyes, and I don't think you have a soul. And looked back at me and said, we understand each other.
He's running this country, and at least he's a leader, you know, unlike what we have in this country.
Yeah, but again, he kills journalists that don't agree with him.
Well, I think our country does plenty of killing also, Joe. So.
You know, we're laser focused on the stakes of November's election, right? And we spent the better part of 8 years warning about the dangers of Donald Trump. As we, as a country, sort of careen into November, we've got the guy that has nicer things to say about Putin than about any of our Democratic allies out in the lead. What explains that, in your view, Rick Stengel?
You know, someday the true story of the relationship between Trump and Putin and Trump and Russia will be written. We don't know it now completely. I mean, you know, from the time he's been trying to have a hotel in Moscow to various other things. But I think the thing that explains it, and I'm sad to say, is that he has sort of a child's view of what strength is. I mean, ever since Roy Cohn told him that he had to be strong and always appear strong, he respects people that appear strong. In the previous clip, you know, Xi Jinping appears strong, Orban appears strong, Putin appears strong. It's this juvenile, childish playground sense of strength. And unfortunately, I think a lot of voters buy into that as well. They think that is a sign of strength. In fact, it's a sign of weakness. He's a historically weak candidate, and people should realize that.
Evelyn, what is the view from Moscow? There's always been less affection, but a real enthusiasm for playing Trump. Not as slobbery as Trump is to Putin, but Putin seems to always be on the right message as Trump and Tucker Carlson and that whole echo chamber. What is the current view about what's at stake for Russia in November?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, Nicole, the Russians on the Ukrainian battlefield and on the world stage, they're not winning. They're resorting to crazy tactics. You talked about killing in the clips. You know, we talked about killing. All the presidents talked about killing. The Russians, there's new reporting that they tried to assassinate the head of the major German arms manufacturer Rheinmetall, which makes all the ammunition that we are providing to Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is getting increasingly nervous about his situation in Ukraine. So he's lashing out. He's really upping the ante again. Now targeting Western, businessmen, and also conducting sabotage operations in the West. But he's in a stalemate on the ground, and so he would like Trump to come into office so that he can make a deal. And a deal that would be favorable to Russia and obviously unfavorable to Ukraine. So I see Putin as someone who's quite weak right now, contrary to the way President Trump sees him. But he's hanging in there because he's hoping that Donald Trump will win. And Donald Trump is useful to him. I don't believe that he respects him tremendously. We saw that when Tucker Carlson did the interview with Putin, Putin was actually quite dismissive and disrespectful to him if you paid attention. So he regards, I think, all of these Americans who are friendly towards him for their own, weird reasons as useful idiots.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn. MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.